When last our heroes met, they just got to this big port city where it was essentially like this trade outpost for a bunch of rich families. Some of you probably know where I'm going with this. So just as a recap, our party escaped a slave auction. In tow, they have their super wagon, which is basically a giant camper. They have stolen a bunch of things from this rich noble family called House Michaels, which they have the eldest son named Donovan in their captivity. And they also have 2 elf boys from a family called Ias Durathil. And they just arrived at a port town where a bunch of rich families tend to live. Let's see what happens. So, the first thing they do is they decided to either sell or try to barter with some of their ill-gotten gains. But one of the things that needs to happen is they need to enter town inconspicuously. Now, last time we met, I introduced Hogger, and in his artwork, he is wearing this suit. Now, normally he doesn't actually wear that. Normally he would wear some like leather armor and some very traditional like berserking barbarian gear. But one of the goals that Hogger decided to do throughout his campaign was to formally end slavery within this nation, because he as far as this nation was concerned, was part of what was called a non-civilized race, being a null. So he started doing things to make him seem more civilized and to basically kind of PR his way into being accepted genuinely. It was actually a really cool character concept. So one of the things that he did was when they raided House Michaels, he stole this really cool looking suit, and he had like one of the other characters kind of adjust it for him. Now, another thing that he did is barbarians have an ability called illiterate. It's not really an ability, it's actually more of a hindrance. Technically speaking, at the start of a game, a barbarian cannot read or write. They don't have any written language. So, one of the things that Hogger did in order to make up for it, instead of investing skill points into linguistics or whatever in order to read and write, he instead bought a pair of magical glasses, much like these, and these glasses were enchanted with read and comprehend language. So one of the things that he noticed with humans is a lot of times they would say things like, "Oh, I need my reading glasses," whenever they read something. So Hogger adapted that into his behavior. Whenever presented with a piece of paper, he'd be like, "Oh, apologies, I can't read without my reading glasses." Now, the read and comprehend language spell isn't exactly meant for that, but it was such a cool role-playing thing, I gave it to him anyway, because that was like the neatest thing ever. So, Hogger has a disguise, and he's ready to go into town. Meanwhile, the other characters are kind of gearing up, and they're ready to go in as well. Rex elected to stay behind, but the people who decided to go in was Vahan, Cecil, Tarek, and Hogger, and Doreen, and Doris. By the way, there was some disparity last time. My cousin actually watched the Dragons of the Grove video, and she noticed that I said her character's name was Doreen. Technically speaking, no, she said her character's name was Doris. Technically, that's correct. However, at the start of our campaign, her name was Doreen, but then later she switched to Doris because it was easier to say. So Doreen and Doris are the same person, and I'll probably switch in between them. Sorry. Hogger, Tarek, Cecil, Doris, and Vahan all decide to go into town. Before they went into town, however, Rex and Yuria decided to stay behind. That is because they wanted to watch the elf boys. But the party realized that they had no real way to communicate with them. So, earlier in one of the sessions, randomly rolled, Tarek got what was called a robe of bones. And a robe of bones is essentially this robe that lets him like pull out like a random skeleton and kind of like just put it there as like a random animated skeleton. Like basically a really easy monster. He used his Rebuke Undead ability on the skeleton. That way he could mentally communicate with it regardless of distance. He was basically using that skeleton as like a quick means of communication between him and the wagon. They decided to sell some of their ill-gotten gains. They basically sold the silverware, like basic things that they didn't need, and they started getting some gold pieces here and there. One of the valuable things that they stole, however, were a bunch of paintings. They decided that the best place to go and hawk this was a local auction. They went there and they presented, after buying some new clothes, of course, and Hogger's all spiffied up and looking good, and he's got his glasses, and they they decided to present the paintings to this auctioneer who has appraised them, and he has determined that like the general value of most of them. And most of them he did not actually like really bat an eye at. Just like, okay, this is good, this is good, this is good. We'll get a couple hundred gold pieces out of it, maybe 1,000 for some really prestigious ones. But then I did a random roll, and one of the paintings was like this incredibly valuable, incredibly famous piece from like some artist. I'd never named him, but it's like a Michelangelo original, something like that. And that got his attention. He asked them, "Where did you get this painting?" Because he verified that it was real. And rather than lie and say, "Oh, we found it," they just kind of outright said, "Oh, we got it as a reward for House Michaels. We're adventurers." And I had them roll bluff, and they got a decent score. They got a decent score. And so the auctioneer, just kind of poker facing, it went, okay. He took the painting, but he also was still really excited about it. He was really excited about the painting, and he said, well, if that's the case, and if you're auctioning off this really prestigious painting, you should be our honored guests. So he gave them a bunch of gold pieces up front, and he had a bunch of guys come up and say, we're going to escort you to the VIP section, and we're going to serve you dinner, we're going to bring lobster and all this stuff. Cecil said, by the way, that he's vegetarian, so he couldn't eat that, so they decided to bring him salad and stuff, and they're doing all these things in order to make this group really, really comfortable. And the party kind of sees through it right away. They know how I DM at this point. We've been playing together for years. But to their credit, they decided to roll with it. They're going to see what happens. So at this auction, the party went ahead and they kind of see what I'm doing. And they go upstairs anyway, and they go into the auction. And they sit in the VIP section, like on a second tier, separated from the rest of the audience. And they're just kind of enjoying the high life that they've just been given. They're eating like lobster. They're eating good food. They've been given like some special treatment. They've given some gold and some wine. Really nice things. And then the auction begins. And as the auction began, they started like bringing out things like, they started bringing out some of the paintings that they had, some like pottery, some other things. And then what really pissed off the party is they started bringing out slaves. They brought out I think another knoll, like a troglodyte, some other things. And then what really grinded their gears is they brought out a Salazin. Now, a Salazin in this particular country, despite it being like a kind of a monstrous person, they are legally considered a civilized race. So now these rich folks, once again, are not honoring their own laws, and they're just blatantly auctioning off someone that they shouldn't be. And by the way, this Salazin had like an iron choker and was in iron cuffs. I mentioned in the last video, these Salazin are based off of the Conan the Adventurer cartoon. In that cartoon, if these serpent men came into contact with a material called star metal, that would send them into another dimension. Now, in my campaign, that's not what happens. They don't get sent into another dimension. Instead, Salazin are just allergic to metal. They can't touch it, otherwise they'll get sick and break out into hives and stuff. And this guy was wrapped in iron. The only thing that a Salazin can wear is gold and like certain non-reactive metals. And this Salazin was just sick and just like looking awful on stage. And the party was furious. And they noticed that a particular house was bidding on it, and it was a House Michaels representative. And it wasn't anyone super important, but it was like a cousin or something, and they just charted that right next to the pissed off section on their little checkbox there. The auction goes on for a little while longer, and the party starts bidding on slaves. They're like buying them up, and they're promising huge sums of gold too, like thousands. This is money they don't have yet, but they're throwing it down because they're not taking this. This is not acceptable. And a lot of it was being led by Hogger, and they were being super cool. It was another great moment of role-playing for the dragons here, or for this party. And so finally, as the piece de resistance, they wheel out the great big fancy painting that the party acquired, like the Michelangelo piece. But instead of the auctioneer coming out, a new person comes out. A very regal-looking Masic who had a very expensive flintlock pistol. And this man was said to the crowd, earlier this week, a group of individuals broke into my home, destroyed it, and stole all my valuables, including this painting. And that group is up there, sitting in the VIP section. At that point, the VIP people that were like, that escorted the party up there turned out to be elite armed guards, and they surrounded them. Now, the party kind of expected this, and they knew I was going to pull something like this. But quick thinking and quick reaction, before they drew, like, they couldn't draw their weapons, they surrendered them earlier. But before anything could happen, Tarek stood up and pointed to him and said, "If you attack us, your eldest son dies." Nat 20 on intimidation. God damn, dude. They're basically at an impasse here. Like, the party is being surrounded by guards, and they just threatened one of the most powerful men in this kingdom right to his face and in front of some of the most influential people in the kingdom. And it was a really cool, intense situation. The guy that was standing before them, his name was Donathan. You know, his son Donovan, and he was Donathan. So Donathan, not wanting his eldest son to die, basically, like, turned it around, and he said, like, "Do you hear that, crowd? Not only do they burn my home and steal my goods, they have my eldest son captive." It was at that point Tarek stood up and said, "We went into your home. Not only did you attack us first, not only are you holding an illegal slave auction twice, you also had the body of 2 dryads inside of your summer home." And they rolled again, another nat 20 in persuasion. The country that they're in is basically the elf country, like the high elf country that has like sections in the Druids of the Grove, and they also have connections in various arcane circles. And not only that, they still have a strong connection to nature. And this guy, the party just kind of outed this guy as someone who killed dryads with another nat 20. And this was just fantastic role-playing, because all the nobles in this house started believing them. The party started spilling the beans on all the illegal things that they discovered inside this house, and they were making really convincing cases. The elves, like the elf nobles in this room, started to believe them as Donathan of House Michaels started losing his cool and started betraying himself a little bit. Those 2 nat 20s really shook him up. And so he's kind of like, "Well, you have no proof." And the party's like, "Yeah, but you still did it. We can go get it. We buried them. We didn't burn them." And so they're like at this point, like Donathan's like list of crimes is starting to pile up more than like the parties. Like, they're starting to make the case, "Well, we're doing this in self-defense." Meanwhile, Donathan's like, you know, "You don't have proof and stuff," but he's losing his cool on stage. Essentially, at this point, the party starts demanding terms. "You attacked us first, and we have proof. Also, you killed dryads, and we have your son hostage, as well as 2 kids from Ias Durathil. Either you stop this right now, or they're going to die, and we're going at war." And so, like, with their great role playing and a combination between that and their really good dice rolls, they were just on fire this session. I cannot express how good they just turned my scenario around and flipped it on its head and made it like in their favor. They just kind of ruined the reputation of House Michaels. Now, granted, they didn't have proof for any of this, but they made really good cases. It was amazing. So essentially, what really came out of this is they had hostages. At the very least, they had that. And it was 2 noble sons of elves and Donathan's son as well. So essentially, they're like, "What are your demands?" And essentially, I kind of let the party just kind of say, give whatever demands they wanted. They demanded 100,000 gold pieces. First of all, that is an insane amount of money. In D&D, you don't come across or I think we were playing Pathfinder at the time, you don't come across 100,000 gold pieces until way later. They were demanding this right now, and they were like level 4 or 5 at best. And the thing is, they knew House Michaels had it. House Michaels is the, like, keeper of coin and secretary of treasury of this entire nation. They had the money. They also demanded 2 scrolls of resurrection for the dryads that House Michael killed, and they demanded a 1-day head start in exchange for the hostages. And they kept rolling good, and they kept presenting their cases good, and I gave it to them, man. Like, guys, they earned it. They freaking killed it. Their RP was so god dang good this session. They nailed it. They got everything they asked for. Later, the party was outside the auction house. The armed guards were around them, but they still had it. They went and collected Donathan and the elf boys, and they exchanged it. Donathan went in and he wheeled out a chest full of gold. He gave them 2 scrolls of resurrection. Also, he even though he denied killing those dryads, he gave them the scrolls of resurrection, just saying that was on top of their terms. And the elves of the elf guards of this town swore on the god of magic that they would not pursue them for 1 day. They won the encounter. They got it. So essentially speaking, the party just made out. They went to their super wagon, they packed up, and they headed out immediately. And by the way, they started getting really, really paranoid. They started killing messenger birds as things were happening. They were doing everything they could to stop the spread of information from this town, because now, now that they made this exchange and they demanded so much money from House Michaels and they made all these wild claims, they're now basically the #1 America's Most Wanted inside this country. Cecil, however, he went a different way. He transformed into a bird and he flew off north again while the party traveled south to the dwarf country. Cecil took the scrolls of resurrection traveling north. He went back to the place where they buried the dryads. Being a bird, he could travel very quickly. He dug them up as like a wolverine or something. He cast the scrolls and he brought them back to life, and he explained the situation to them. The dryads, kind of knowing who Cecil was, knowing that he was a druid of the grove, they swore that if the party ever needed it, they would always find friends with the druids of the grove because of what the party just did for them. Bringing these dryads back to life. So Cecil had this really good moment with them. He gave them a hug. They swore friendship. Dryads temporarily gave Cecil the ability to fly through the trees like a dryad does, and it allowed him to travel very, very quickly down south. He quickly caught up with the party in the super wagon. The super wagon, however, is taking off like a bat out of hell. They are just driving as fast as they can, and they're doing everything they can to suppress information getting south there. They were killing carrier pigeons as they saw them. They were bribing people not to talk. All kinds of things were happening because they now have 100,000 gold pieces to play with. They were just kind of doing everything they can to make their get this happening. They came across a couple of farmers. They traded horses and paid them a large sum of gold for fresh horses and to fix up their wagon for them to make it better and faster and stuff, and just doing everything they could. Eventually, they made really good progress. They traveled really, really far south. They made it to the edge of the territories. This is the border between the elf country and the dwarf country. And it was there that they ran into the border guard, and they basically bribed him with a big handful of coins, and they got into this town at the edge of the territory. One thing that I forgot to mention earlier is one of the things that the party bargained for is they also demanded the release of all the slaves at the auction. And so now there's a small accompaniment of NPCs that join the characters inside the super wagon. The Knoll that I mentioned earlier just kind of ran off. He wasn't really interested in joining the party, but the other characters, the other NPCs there did. There was a troglodyte that had a name that they couldn't pronounce. We kind of treated troglodytes in this campaign kind of like murlocs, kind of like in that Sonic show. They're really tiny and fish-like. Vahan kind of hired him on as a butler. They bought him a cute little suit and the serving tray and stuff, and she paid him well. She paid him a gold piece a day, which is an obscene amount of money for any kind of manservant in D&D and Pathfinder. There was a lizard man that joined the party that they nicknamed One-Eyed Jim. He was a former rogue who lost an eye, and they just called him One-Eyed Jim. And then the Salazin that I mentioned earlier also joined the party, and his name was Tuku. We'll talk about Tuku more in a bit, but Tuku was what was called a soul artist. In my campaign, there's essentially another branch of magic outside of Divine and Arcane called soul arts. Think of soul arts like the Dark Souls or Demon Souls kind of magic, where you basically take souls, use them as fuel for your spells, and then cast spells in that way. It's taboo in like 99% of cultures, but in Salazin culture, it was very, very common. And he was a soul artist from there. And we'll talk about that more in a bit. Tuku won't really play a part for a couple of sessions, but he did join the party inside their super wagon. So now they've got like this small little entourage of NPCs with them inside the super wagon, including Henry the Butler, One-Eyed Jim, who is now really good friends with Tarek, and of course, Tuku. So they made it to this border town, and at this border town, they started looking for rumors, because Yuria was asking them again, can we go into the Underdark, and if you take me home, not only will my family reward you, it'll also kind of take some of the heat off of you, since you'll be basically in an area that you can't capture. Now, I'm going to go on a little bit of a tangent, because I mentioned the Underdark a couple times. To those that don't know, the Underdark is basically the subterranean world within most D&D campaigns. Now, in my opinion, most people do the Underdark wrong. Essentially, most people do the Underdark as this big-ass cave under the ground. It's essentially this network of large tunnels that's really not much different from the surface world, and to be honest, I kind of hate it. Because the Underdark should be like this territory that's hard to get to and hard to get out of. Because it's just this dark, miserable place that's really, really difficult to live in. And I think most people do this wrong. If you live in the Underdark, why wouldn't you want to leave? I mean, unless you're there for economic reasons or whatever, like, there's really no reason to stay there, because it's known on the surface that things are different. Why would you live there? This especially makes sense because most things that live in the Underdark are evil, and they have, like, this mission of conquest, and they want to, like, take over everything. Why wouldn't you go to the surface where everyone's a lot weaker than you and take over that way? It doesn't make sense to me. So in my campaign, the Underdark is closer to Ravenloft. Ravenloft is kind of this demi-plane that exists outside of most realities, and it's really, really difficult to get in and nearly impossible to get out. In my campaign, I set up my Underdark like that. It's really, really difficult to get into the Underdark and damn near impossible to get out. And Yuria has no memory on how she got out of the Underdark. So they start talking to these dwarves inside of this border town, looking for rumors. And the dwarves told them there's a few ways into the Underdark that they know of. You can go to the dwarf capital, where there's actually a door you can go in and out of, but the dwarves guard it with, like, such fervor. It's basically like the entryway into whatever the Underdark was in Dragon Age Origins. It's like where they try to keep out all the monsters, and they frequently take crusades into there and start killing things. It's not a good relationship. So, and not only that, it would be very public if they went to the big main dwarf town and tried to go in through there. So they elect not to do that. There's also rumored to be a lot of different entrances scattered about the dwarf country. So they followed up on one of the rumors that there's a nearby cave that has a secret entrance that'll let them go into it. It's guarded by some kind of monster, so people don't go into it. So they decided, let's go to this particular entrance. And so they did. They start traveling up these mountains and through these different passes, and they eventually found this secret entrance. They did some kind of like doohickey magic that opened a door like into the mountains, and they start walking in. With them, they had One-Eyed Jim. It was Tarek, Rex, Vahan, Yuria, and Hager and Cecil. So they had all these characters, and they went in, and they just started walking through it. They encountered like some giant spiders, they encountered some monsters here and there, and eventually they came across like this large pit leading downwards. So they decided to investigate this pit. They looked out into there, and it like these giant spiders started coming out. They had this fight with it, and eventually something happens. One-Eyed Jim, all of a sudden, turns on Rex. He pulls out both of his daggers, he stabs Rex, like, in the lungs, and then kicks Rex down into the pit. And they're like, what the hell just happened? And they look up, and on the ceiling, looking down at them, is this long, white-haired, dark-skinned vampire. He's climbing on the walls using spider climb. And immediately they like get ready for a tough fight. and they did like a perception roll to kind of figure out what the hell just happened. And I let them know that this particular vampire is kind of the master of this lair, and he knew that they entered the cave as soon as they walked in. As soon as they activated the magic doohickey that opened the door and let them walk in, the vampire knew about them, and he started following them from behind using spider climb on the ceiling. And it was at this point that they started freaking out. Rex was gravely injured. He got hit with hold person, and One-Eyed Jim just kind of like got him with a critical sneak attack, kicked him into the pit. They were getting kind of bodied by all these giant spiders, and they're barely making out of it alive. It was thanks to Tarek and Yuria. Tarek looked up and he cast his most powerful rebuke spell, which kind of freaked out the vampire, and he kind of like ran away. But not before he ran away, though, he vowed vengeance on Tarek in particular. He found that really offensive that he tried to cast Rebuke Undead on him. So the vampire ran away, One-Eyed Jim ran away. The party at this point is low on everything. They used a lot of their healing potions in that last big fight. They're running out of spells. They just lost Jim, and Rex was just about dead. And the party decided, rather than trying to pursue this, they packed up and left. Like, it hurt them a lot to lose Jim, especially Tarek. Tarek formed, like, this really close bond with Jim. He actually took the leadership feat in order to add One-Eyed Jim to his, like, entourage. But he decided it was best... it was best to kind of cut their losses, at least at the time. They didn't think that Jim would die, or if he did die and turn into a vampire, they figured they had enough money at least to go and get another scroll of resurrection in order to bring Jim back to life. So that was their justification for it. And it was a hard decision for them to do, but they tried to leave the cave. They went back to the cave entrance, and the cave was sealed off. They started to panic for a bit, but luckily, Cecil was a weird druid. He didn't actually prepare a lot of combat spells. He prepared a lot of utility spells. And a couple that he prepared was Shape Stone. Now, they were locked inside a cave behind a magical door, and they realized that they couldn't, like, magic this stone away, so instead, they used Stone Shape on, like, the adjacent wall and made, like, another entrance out, like, just basically circumventing the secret entrance to the cave. And they got out that way. It was at that point that the party went back to the wagon, they drove away, started licking their wounds, they left Jim behind, like, with really heavy hearts. It really killed them. They were really upset about this. But they vowed to come back, and it was at that point that this vampire, who they discovered his name was Anderthil, swore revenge on the party and eventually became one of the long-lasting, like, wandering antagonists of this campaign. He basically, throughout the rest of this series, he would come back with, like, a vengeance every time. It basically became like a plague to them. And we'll get back to that later, but we're going to end Story 2 right there. And I hope you enjoyed this. I really love retelling the story of the Dragons of the Grove. It was my best campaign. There's so many details I couldn't even actually finish. Like, throughout the story, Tarek and Yuria, while they're communicating through their languages, they learn a lot about each other, and they start to develop, like, this really close friendship that eventually, like, blossomed into, like, a real sweet romance. Cecil started, like, doing more things with animals, and he started, like, summoning more and becoming, like, a really influential druid. Hogger was, like, doing all this political stuff, like, and this was only within the first couple sessions. It was so freaking good. And Vahan, Vahan was really, really good too, because she was, like, trying to make their cabin more livable because she was used to this noble life. And it was so good. And with that, I'll catch you guys next time. Be sure to subscribe for more Dragons of the Grove and for more GM tips and for our other campaigns. And I'll catch you next time. See ya.